All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along bright and early to this talk on the 10 principles of modern release management. So the idea behind this session today is to give you an overview of some of the things to bear in mind over the next couple of days as you go around the conference. If you're thinking of moving from a sandbox development flow to introducing Git, using Salesforce DX or other modern practices, give you some things to think about as you go through these other sessions. So quick introduction, my name is Jason, I'm from GearSet. We are a Salesforce release management tool designed to making changes, deployments, and tracking those to your orgs ingeniously simple. If you want to catch me after the talk or any of my team, we've got a booth just over on the other side of the floor over there. So it's an interesting time to work as a release manager or developer in Salesforce because we're going a little bit of a sort of mini revolution at the moment. Over the last couple of years, there have been a lot of changes through things like Salesforce DX, the introduction of Git, and generally changing the ways of working, which mean there's a lot of opportunity for people to change the ways their organization make changes, improve that process, and generally make things a little bit easier and fun to work in. So the first of those three areas is through new tools. Salesforce DX is obviously one of the main focuses of this conference, is a relatively new tool brought out by Salesforce in the last couple of years. And it gives people an interesting way of working with things like scratch orgs and new changes over this CLI. And the second part of that is the introduction of Git. So traditionally in Salesforce, you might be working in sandboxes, but thanks to changes through things like Salesforce DX, there's more of a focus now in source control-driven development, and that brings a lot of opportunities and different ways of working. And the third part of that is there's also been a lot of change in third-party tools. So obviously come from GearSet, we're a third-party vendor building release management on the platform. I think in the last few years there's been a lot of development there in terms of choice and availability of what you can work with. The second one is new orgs. So obviously traditionally in Salesforce you have your production environments and you have your sandboxes. They're fairly long-lived, they're fairly complex environments where you make your changes. But with the advent of DX, we've got the Scratch org. So this is a new org, it's short-lived, it's ephemeral, you can load it with your metadata and data, track your changes in a safe environment, and then delete it when you're done. And this is a fundamentally different way of working on the platform, and it takes some sort of adjusting to and how you work on it, but it gives a lot of opportunities as well of new ways you can work. And as a result of this, we've got a change in the way people work. So on the screen there, you have sort of a traditional development flow where you might be making changes in developer sandboxes. Those changes get merged through into an integration environment, through towards UAT staging, and finally out into production. And that works well for a lot of teams, but it becomes a bit challenging as you start to have multiple development streams and people stepping on each other's toes. So as a result of integrating Git, Salesforce DX, and other tools, we're starting to move towards a little bit of a flow now where people are making more of a source-driven development. So instead of those changes all going through in sandboxes and then out to production, you now have Git as the source of truth. So you work in your own feature branches, you merge those in, and then you deploy from Git out to your different environments. So we'll talk through this in a little bit, but it's just something to bear in mind in terms of how things have been changing recently. So with all those changes in terms of tooling, in terms of availability and processes, one of the questions that we often get asked as a release management vendor is, what does good look like? You know, what should my team be doing? And it's difficult to give a single answer on that. There are so many different ways of working depending on if you're a solo admin or if you've got a multidisciplinary team around the world. There's no definitive answer as to one size fits all. But there are some principles you can bear in mind which you can use to guide your process as you go through that evolution. So what I'm going to do now is run through a little bit of a quick overview of 10 things to keep in mind as you go through that journey of adopting DX, adopting source control, things like continuous integration, static code analysis, and other things like that you can work on. So before I go too much further, just a tiny bit of terminology here. I can assume most of you are in some way familiar with source control. Source control is essentially, or version control, is just a way of tracking changes to files over time. Git is the most popular provider of that, and within that, GitHub is just a way of provisioning that in a cloud service that you can log into in your browser. Within source control, you then have a concept of a repository, which is essentially just a container where all your files sit. And then within repositories, you have branches. And branches are separate working environments, so you can clone your work, make changes without stepping on anyone else's toes before they get merged back into a production environment before you release them to your end users. And commits are simply sets of changes that you push into a branch. So every time you make a change to an Apex class, or you add a custom field, or you change a profile setting, you'll commit those one after one into that branch to track those changes. And that gives you a really nice audit trail of what change has been made and by who, and a lot of flexibility in terms of managing conflicts. So let's start with number one. Git is the source of truth. So this is obviously a change that goes along with adopting source-driven development, but traditionally the Salesforce org in your production environment was was the source of truth. That was where your users worked, that was where all the changes were made, and that was your single starting point. But if you're going to be moving towards a source-driven development flow, that has to change. You have to start treating Git as your source of truth. That means that all your changes go through Git. You treat Git as sacred. You don't make changes in production. You're not going to make changes directly in your master branch in Git. You go through that same process of tracking that. And the benefit that gives you is you have much more visibility into what changes were made. You've got a stable starting point. So if you want to deploy the same changes into your sandbox, into QA, into UAT, and into production, Git gives you that single starting point that you can work from. But it's important if you're going to develop that process that you actually bake Git in from the start. So you can't consider it an afterthought. If you try and build a sandbox development flow and tack Git on the end, it's not really going to work. You have to have that core concept that Git is now going to be where all those files live, where all those changes are tracked, and then from there you can move on into pushing those changes into different environments. So number 2, this one is around simplicity. It can be tempting when you're coming up with a new flow, especially with new tools and new orgs and fun things like that, to try and cover every single scenario that you can think of. What kind of edge cases can we look at? How can we deal with different teams? How can we manage all of that process? But what you can end up with there is you can fall into a trap of building something that's so complicated and so difficult and covers every different scenario that actually it's difficult for people to use, and you introduce more complexity than you actually save by working in a nice source-driven development flow. So what I would really advise, and what we advise at GearSet if people come to ask us about release management, is keep it as simple as you can. Start with that subset of your metadata you want to source control. Start with a nice easy path of moving changes from your sandbox out into production. And then once you've got that process working, then you can start adding complexity and layering on top of that. But if you start to go from all to nothing in one, you'll probably end up with something which doesn't work and it becomes more of a maintenance headache than actually just sticking to your traditional model. So you got there that sort of famous quote around perfection being not when there's something more you can add, when there's nothing less you can take away. And I think that's something that you should really bear in mind as you move forward throughout these new processes. So number 3, this is around branch management and developing features. So we've got a nice diagram there from the Microsoft developer blogs talking around working with Git. What it can be tempting to do when you have new feature branches you work in. So you as a developer and an admin, you've got your nice feature branch, it's separate from everyone else. You can make your changes in there and sort of work on them in isolation. But one of the things that can be tempting then is that you keep that branch going for a long time. You get feature creep, you get more things you build in it, it stays open for a long time, I can just add another thing here, I can just add another bit there. And that's all good until you actually try and merge that branch into your repository and then deploy it out to your sandboxes. If you've been working for weeks or months without talking to anyone else and without tracking those changes, you're going to end up with merge hell, as they've got there, when you actually try and merge all those files together. So if you find 3 or 4 people have been making the same Apex class, they've been working on those changes, then you have to go in and manually resolve that. And if you've got a big org and a lot of changes and a big project, that's a really painful process. So when you're working with branches, you should consider them as short-lived as possible and as tightly scoped as you can. So a feature branch should contain the absolute minimal amount of work that you can deliver to an end user to give them value, and it should exist only for the period of time that you're making those changes before they get pushed out into your sandbox. And that will give you a really nice way of pushing those changes more quickly, reducing that conflict, and as you can see there, you end up with no merge hell. So number 4 is around testing. I'm sure I don't have to talk to you all about the importance of unit testing. Obviously, you have requirements on the platform around code coverage, and it's something that you should be doing to increase the reliability of your code as you work. But it's important that you run those tests on a regular basis and that you get the visibility of those test results to the people who need to work on them. So it's no good having all the tests in the world if no one actually tracks when they fail and no one goes in and fixes them. So we've got a sort of simple example there of running tests as users so you can actually run good tests. But then it's important that you run them regularly, you get visibility into those test results, everyone can act on them. Because what you don't want to end up with is you figuring, and we actually come to release, that 2 teams are working on different things, you're not delivering what your end users actually want. So one of the things that we built into GearSet is a really simple way of automating your unit tests. You can set up jobs in a few clicks, we'll run them every day for you, we'll track your code coverage, we'll tell you if any tests have failed, and you can set notifications to get emails, text messages, Slack messages, Microsoft Teams and Chatter, all posted to the teams, they can go in and fix them. It's just one of those ways of increasing visibility is really key to getting the best results from your tests. So then, following on from that in a similar vein, we've got bad tests are worse than no tests. Having bad tests is dangerous. You can end up with a false sense of security. If you're not actually testing what you think You might be working forwards, thinking your tests are passing and everything is great, until you actually come to deploy that change into production, and you realize that you haven't been building what your end users want. You're not delivering value to those business users. So it's important that you bear in mind how to write your tests to make them effective. Now, I can't go into that in too much detail in this talk because we're fairly limited in time, but Gearset and I have given previous talks around best practice test management, and I'm sure there are a load of other talks going on during the next couple of days on that. But if you want to talk in more detail about that, then feel free and grab me afterwards. Because what you don't end up with is this scenario where everyone's been working in their tests and it's all good until you finally try and ship it and you realize you've had different specs and it all goes wrong at that point. You want to discover that when you're building the blueprints, not when you're actually finally connecting the bridge. Number 6 is play around with scratch orgs. So this is a new concept. There will be loads of sessions over the next 2 days on what scratch orgs are, how to play around with them, how to get the benefits from them. And it's something that really is worth experimenting because it's so new. The idea of an org you can spin up. You can do it in about 20, 30 seconds. You can fill it with your metadata. You can fill it with your data. You can test it in a safe environment. And when you're done with it, you can just throw it away. That's a real change in how you work on the platform. And that's something that can really alter how quickly you can deliver tests, how quickly you can deliver those results to end users. And it's something to play around with. But one of the challenges around DX is it is a command line tool. So if you're not familiar with working with command line tools, it can be a little bit challenging to how to get into that. So one of the things that we built into Gearset, again, is a really simple way of hooking those up. So you can link your dev hubs just with a couple of clicks. And from there, you can spin up scratch orgs without using the command line. You can fill them with your metadata. You can fill them with your data. When you're ready to get rid of them, you can then delete them or move on. And that whole process can be done without using the command line really, really simply with a couple of clicks. So number 7 is quality over quantity. This is static code analysis. So I've got the logo up there for PMD, which is a testing framework for code. It does have various different platforms, but Apex is one of them. And the idea here is try and get some consistency amongst your team. If you have a large team, everyone works in slightly different ways in how they write their code. That can become a real maintenance headache if you ever have to go in and look at someone else's code to figure out what's gone wrong, either because maybe unit tests have failed or because you're developing a new feature and you want to work together on it. So it's important not just to write as much code as you can, but to make that code really, really tightly formatted. And one of the ways you can do that is by enforcing code analysis. So you can set up these frameworks which scan through your code. They give you feedback on things like naming conventions, how to write your code, structuring, all that sort of thing. Another aspect you can really get from that is around security. So it's important that if you're writing code, you're not introducing any security exceptions, you're not potentially exposing your business to extra risk. And running code analysis on your code as you write it can give you that feedback as you go. So again, release management tool, we decided to build this into Gearset. So every time you run deployments through Gearset, if you set up continuous integration jobs, if you run change monitoring jobs, we'll run the code analysis for you as you go, and you'll get that feedback instantly. So you don't have to worry about getting that feedback a month's time when you finally ship it to production. You can get the immediate feedback that, hey, you've got some issues with your Apex class here, you've got issues with style or potentially a security exception. And you can customize these rule sets for your team, so they have different ways of working. You can upload those, set them up, and then have a consistent way of working across your whole team. Number 8 is around automation. So you obviously have the famous story, if you've got 1,000 monkeys and 1,000 typewriters, you'll eventually write the whole works of Shakespeare. But I don't know about you, but most of us don't really have the luxury of that much time and resource to actually get everything done. So when you come to a modern Git-based development flow, one of the key things that makes it work is automation. You don't want to be running the same tasks over and over and over again, because we've got better things to do with our day than doing that. So this is looking at things like continuous integration is the most common example of automation, but you've also got things like running a unit test and static code analysis and other things which you might do by hand. So continuous integration is one of the key ones that comes up. Essentially, this is the principle that you're making changes in, say, your branch in Git, or maybe in your developer sandbox, and you want to have those pushed into another environment to test as quickly as you can. And that testing, if you do it quickly, means that you can track if things are broken, or if you've broken your code coverage, or unit tests, or that sort of thing. And it can be difficult to set up. There's a lot of different tools to do it. You have things like Jenkins behind the scenes and other tools that you can automate. But with a tool like Gearset, we made it really, really simple by baking it straight into the app. So you can set up CI jobs in a few clicks. They'll automatically run your code analysis, they'll test your orgs, and they'll give you a full history of what's been deployed. And CI here is really one of those key principles of modern Git-based development. If you want to get those changes quickly, you want to iterate quickly, you want to have short-lived feature branches, you want to get those things out to production, then you have to make sure you're continually testing and working on your code so that you can actually get that feedback straight away. And CI is one of the key areas that falls into that. But there are other areas of automation as well. So number 9 is around how you track and respond to changes being made across your different environments. So one of the great things about Salesforce, it's very easy for anyone to go in to make changes directly in sandboxes or in production environments to get those fixes out and new features to your end users. But one of the problems that you face if you're going to enable a really fast development flow is how do you actually respond to those and how do you deal with them? So one of the changes you want to look at as you start to build this modern process is how can you be more active in tracking those changes and fixing them? So this is not only things like your unit testing, but it's around making sure that you've got an idea and visibility into who's made that change in production yesterday, or who's merged that into my branch, and what was that change and why. And Git there gives you a really nice visibility because every change is tracked. You can track to the user. You go through pull requests to merge your changes, and those mean they're peer reviewed. One of the other things you can do is actually get a good view into what's happening on your production environments on a day-to-day basis. So with Gearset, you can set up what we call change monitoring jobs. And what these will do is they'll track an org, so typically production, but it can be any of your environments. We'll take snapshots of it every day on a rolling basis and then track the changes between your snapshots. And then you can have those notifications sent to your team. So that if someone goes through your process and makes a change in production, you can get an email about it. You can see exactly what that change is at the line level of the XML. And then you can either roll it back, you can deploy it down into your Git flow so that next time you release, you don't accidentally overwrite it. Or you can just have that visibility into your team. Because if you've got multiple feature branches, multiple teams working in parallel, visibility into what everyone's doing and why is a really, really key way of avoiding conflicts and getting things running smoothly. And finally, number 10 is it takes time. If you think you are going to go from everyone working in sandboxes to a complete end-to-end seamless CLI flow in a day, you might have to think again. It's a process that you should iterate on. I really would advise walking before you run. Have a goal of what you want to get to, whether that is a full CI flow with Git, whether that's just introducing some basic source control, whether that's playing around with scratch orgs, and have a goal of what you want to get to, but be prepared to work in stages. Get sort of walk before you can run. Get that core process running, iterate on it, then build and build and build on that framework. And it will take time. It will take time to get a process up and running, not just because you have to actually get the process set up, but you're also dealing with changing people's ways of working. If you suddenly get a process and switch everyone's ways of working overnight, you'll get pushback from people and it won't work properly. So if you can get feedback from people as you go and iterate on it and get their feedback to make it work better, you're much more likely to get a really seamless flow that works. So we've been through a lot very quickly there. A quick recap of some of the main areas we covered about. Git, not Salesforce, is your source of truth. Keep it simple when you build your process and build up from there. Push your changes out as fast as you can. Keep those feature branches small and ship them out. Test and make sure you're running good tests. Make sure you play around with scratch orgs, whether that's through the CLI or using a UI-based tool like Gearset. Static code analysis to make sure you can enforce consistency amongst your teams and the code you're writing and the maintainability of it. Add automation where it's sensible. Don't over-automate just for the sake of it, but if there are tasks you're doing repetitively, then do that. Try and get better visibility into the changes being made across your environments. And finally, don't expect this to happen overnight. So I know I've covered a lot of stuff there very quickly at a high level. If you want more information, feel free to grab me, one of the other Gearset team, just over in our booth over there later on. We also have a free white paper on our website at gearset.com/resources, which goes through a lot of these principles around Git-based development. It gives you much more walkthrough of the process and what that looks like in reality, sort of starting point to consider as you move forwards. Thank you very much.